Have you ever had the unsettling feeling of reliving the exact same scene for the second time, even knowing it's impossible? A commonplace place, a banal conversation, a simple gesture, and suddenly, everything seems frighteningly familiar. Your heart races slightly, your mind tries to find a logical explanation, and the only question that arises is, why does this happen to me? If you've been through this before, stay with me until the end because what you're about to discover might surprise you. Déjà vu is one of those strange experiences that seem to escape the logic of everyday life. It's not a dream, it's not imagination, and it's certainly not something supernatural, despite what many people believe. It's real, it happens to millions of people worldwide and, curiously, it usually arises at the most unexpected moments. Sometimes in a quick conversation, sometimes when entering a place for the first time, sometimes in the middle of a completely ordinary situation. And it is precisely this naturalness that makes it all the more unsettling. How can something so commonplace seem so mysterious? Now, let me ask you an even more provocative question. What if this feeling of déjà vu wasn't just linked to memory, but also to your emotional state? What if anxiety, that silent feeling that often accompanies our routine without us realizing it, played a direct role in all of this? Think about it. How many times do these episodes arise precisely during periods of stress, pressure, mental fatigue, or excessive worry? Coincidence, or a sign of something deeper happening in the brain? Anxiety changes the way the mind works. It alters attention, accelerates thoughts, and leaves the brain in a constant state of alert, as if something important is about to happen at any moment. And when this happens, the perception of reality can suffer small flaws. Not visible flaws, but subtle, almost imperceptible ones. Enough to create the illusion that that moment has already been lived before. Have you noticed this? Have you realized how your mind is different when you are anxious? Perhaps you've never connected the two. Maybe déjà vu has always seemed like just a strange curiosity, a curious trick of the brain, something without much importance. But science has been showing that these experiences can be deeply linked to how we process the present, store memories, and deal with intense emotions. And anxiety, in this context, emerges as a silent but powerful factor. The most intriguing thing is that the more we try to understand what's happening in that moment of déjà vu, the more it seems to elude us. It's quick, intense, and when it ends it leaves only doubt. Was it real? Was it just my imagination? Why did I feel that way now? It's precisely this sequence of questions that makes the phenomenon so fascinating. And that's why so many people identify with it when the subject comes up. If you've ever experienced something like this, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Throughout this video we'll explore the little discussed relationship between anxiety and déjà vu, understanding how the brain reacts under pressure and why these momentary lapses in perception can become more frequent than we imagine. What happens inside your mind in those moments can reveal much more about you than meets the eye. So, take a deep breath, get comfortable, and stick with me. Because from here on out, we're going to start delving into the inner workings of the human brain, and maybe you'll begin to see these strange experiences in a new light. And as we move forward in this conversation, it's worth taking a quick pause, almost like a breather, to truly include you in all of this. Because this topic isn't just theory, it's not just scientific curiosity, it touches on real experiences, moments that many people live in silence. So, if at any point in this beginning you thought, "This has happened to me," or felt that shiver of recognition, let it come out. If this subject makes sense to you, leave a comment here about what has touched you the most so far, or recount a déjà vu experience that you never quite managed to explain. Sometimes, putting it into words helps more than it seems, and it can help other people who read this too. And if you're enjoying this approach, this deeper way of looking at the mysteries of the human brain, liking the video is a simple yet very powerful way to show it. It's not just a click. It's a sign that this type of content deserves to continue being created, explored, and delivered with care. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who also wonder why the mind does what it does. Similarly, subscribing to the channel is almost like saying, "Keep going, I want to delve deeper." Because the next videos follow exactly that line. Strange brain phenomena, scientific curiosities that challenge our perception of reality, and explanations that connect science, emotion, and human experience. When you subscribe, you become part of this curious, restless community interested in understanding what happens inside their own minds. And now that you're here, engaged in this reflection, we can move on. Because from here, the story starts to get even more interesting. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, starting with the point that many people skip or misinterpret. What exactly is déjà vu in simple, direct, and honest terms? Without mysticism, exaggeration, or complicated terms. Déjà vu is not a warning from the universe, it's not a memory from another life, and it's not a supernatural bug. It's a real experience of the human brain, more common than it seems, and it's part of how the mind processes reality in real time. What makes it so intriguing is not the fact that it happens, but the emotional impact it has when it occurs. In essence, déjà vu is that intense and brief feeling of extreme familiarity. It's as if the brain is saying, "I've experienced this before," even when logic dictates otherwise. And the most important detail is this conflict. The emotional brain recognizes something as familiar, while the rational brain knows it's new. This mismatch creates strangeness, doubt, and often a slight discomfort. It's no wonder that many people describe déjà vu as unsettling, even when it only lasts a few seconds. Contrary to what many imagine, déjà vu doesn't mean you're literally remembering something from the past. It happens because the brain works on multiple layers simultaneously. While you're in the present, it compares information, accesses memories, interprets patterns, and makes decisions in fractions of a second. When this process happens in a slightly misaligned way, the sensation of repetition arises. It's not the world that repeats itself, it's perception that gets confused. This phenomenon is especially common in young people and tends to decrease with age, which already indicates that it is linked to a more active, curious, and constantly transforming brain. And this completely changes the narrative. Déjà vu is not a sign of a serious malfunction, but of a brain working intensely, cross-referencing data, experiences, and sensations in an accelerated way. It's almost like looking behind the scenes of an extremely complex system operating in real time. The most curious thing is that déjà vu doesn't occur in extraordinary moments. It appears in simple, everyday situations without any apparent meaning. A common conversation, a neutral environment, a banal scene. That's precisely why it has such an impact. If it were something grand, perhaps the brain would have an easier explanation. But when it happens in the trivial, it challenges our idea of control and predictability of reality. And that's where deeper questions related to mentality, the decisions we make automatically, and how we interpret what is around us come in. There's a hidden truth in this process. The brain doesn't register the world as it is, but as it interprets it. Everything goes through filters, shortcuts, and comparisons. Déjà vu arises when these filters overlap unexpectedly. It's as if the brain recognizes a pattern even before understanding the complete context. This anticipation creates the illusion of remembrance. Not because it has already happened, but because something there resembles something stored, even if in a fragmented way. And here's an essential point for our journey of understanding. Déjà vu is not an isolated error, but a side effect of an extremely efficient system. A brain that tries to predict, accelerate responses, and reduce uncertainties. It wants to understand quickly, decide quickly, react quickly. But sometimes, in this silent haste, it creates shortcuts that confuse conscious perception. The result is this strange feeling of familiarity without a clear origin. When you understand this, the phenomenon ceases to be frightening and becomes revealing. It shows how the mind constructs reality in real time, how decisions are influenced by memories that we don't always consciously access, and how small changes in processing can generate large impacts on how we experience the world. Déjà vu is less an isolated mystery and more a window to observe the complexity of human experience. And the most interesting thing is to realize that this process doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's influenced by emotional states, attention levels, fatigue, mental overload, and everything that shapes the brain's internal workings throughout the day. That's why understanding what déjà vu really is paves the way for understanding why it can become more frequent at certain stages of life or in certain mental states. This is not just a curious phenomenon. It has a direct impact on how we perceive ourselves, on the trust we have in our memories, and on the feeling of control over our own experience. And when we start connecting this with intense emotions such as anxiety, the scenario becomes even more revealing. Because then déjà vu ceases to be just a cerebral curiosity and becomes part of a larger journey of self-knowledge, transformation, and understanding the inner workings of the mind. And before we move on with this exploration, tell me something simple but important. Comment below, "That makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding what anxiety does to the brain completely changes how we perceive experiences like déjà vu. Anxiety isn't just a passing feeling of worry or nervousness. In practice, it's a state of hyperalertness in the brain. It's as if the mind is constantly in vigilance mode, scanning the environment, anticipating scenarios, predicting risks, and trying to prepare for something that hasn't even happened yet. Even when everything seems calm on the outside, inside the anxious brain is in constant motion. When anxiety sets in, the brain prioritizes survival. It speeds up internal processes, reduces pauses, shortens paths, and makes decisions automatically. This happens because, from a biological point of view, anxiety originates as a protective mechanism. The problem arises when this state ceases to be occasional and becomes frequent. The brain begins to function as if it were always facing an invisible threat. And living like this profoundly alters how we perceive the present. An anxious brain is rarely fully present in the moment. It's a few seconds ahead, trying to predict what comes next. It analyzes expressions, interprets tones of voice, anticipates outcomes, and revisits memories to compare patterns. All of this happens silently, in the background of the mind. The impact is that the present ceases to be experienced continuously and becomes fragmented. Small lapses of attention occur, not because the person is distracted, but because the mind is too busy trying to control the future. From a scientific point of view, this makes perfect sense. Studies show that anxiety alters the activity of brain regions linked to attention, memory, and time perception. The brain speeds up. Information enters too quickly, is processed too quickly, and is sometimes registered out of sync. It's like watching a video with slight delays between audio and image. Nothing is really wrong, but the misalignment creates a sense of unease. And it is in this subtle space that experiences like déjà vu find fertile ground. When anxiety is present, the brain tends to recognize patterns more quickly than normal. It does this as a protective strategy. Recognizing something as familiar gives a false sense of control. The problem is that, at times, this recognition happens before the experience is fully processed. The result is the feeling of "I've already lived through this," even when you haven't. It's not real memory, it's poorly synchronized anticipation. This constant state of alert also interferes with how memories are accessed. The anxious brain constantly consults the past to make decisions in the present. It seeks references, past experiences, similar situations. However, in this accelerated process, these memories don't always come complete. Sometimes only fragments emerge: a feeling, a similar scenario, a familiar detail. The conscious mind tries to assemble the puzzle and, not finding a clear origin, interprets it as a repetition of reality. Here lies a hidden truth that is rarely discussed. Anxiety not only alters how we feel, it alters how we perceive reality. It shapes our mindset, influences automatic decisions, and creates the feeling that something is out of place, even when everything seems normal. Déjà vu, in this context, is not an isolated error, but a reflection of this accelerated functioning. It is a side effect of a brain that cannot slow down. The impact of this on the individual journey is profound. Many people experience déjà vu episodes for years without ever connecting them to their emotional state. They look for external explanations, mystify the experience, or simply ignore it. But when we begin to understand the inner workings of the anxious brain, everything takes on another layer of meaning. Déjà vu ceases to be merely curious and becomes a sign of how the mind is coping with excessive stimuli, pressures, and expectations. This state of heightened alertness also explains why anxiety is often accompanied by other strange sensations, such as depersonalization, lapses in attention, a feeling of unreality, or being on autopilot. All these experiences stem from the same place: a brain that is always running a few steps ahead of the present. The transformation begins when we realize that it's not a weakness, but an overloaded system trying to handle everything at once. Understanding this changes how we approach these experiences. Instead of fear, understanding arises. Instead of confusion, revelations emerge. The brain isn't failing, it's trying to protect itself. However, in this constant effort, it ends up creating shortcuts that confuse conscious perception. And it is precisely at this intersection between anxiety, attention, and memory that déjà vu gains strength and frequency. And when we start connecting these dots, we realize there are still deeper layers to explore. Because anxiety doesn't act alone. It interacts directly with how we pay attention, how we register experiences, and how we interpret what's happening around us. And that's where this story begins to reveal something even more interesting about how the human mind works. Before continuing with this reflection, write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this is where a lot of things really start to make sense. When we talk about the connection between anxiety, attention, and memory, we're getting to the heart of the déjà vu phenomenon. These three elements function as silent pillars of our conscious experience. They underpin how we perceive the world, how we register what happens, and how we give meaning to the present. When one of them becomes unbalanced, the entire system feels the impact. Anxiety directly affects attention. An anxious brain has difficulty remaining fully focused on the present moment because it is constantly divided between what is happening and what might happen. The mind becomes fragmented. Part of it observes the present, while another part races ahead, simulating scenarios, assessing risks, anticipating decisions. This creates a curious state in which the person is physically present but mentally scattered, even without realizing it. Attention ceases to be continuous and begins to function in small blocks. This detail is crucial. Attention is the gateway to memory. Everything you remember first passed through the filter of attention. When this filter is unstable, the record of the moment also becomes unstable. The brain may capture a scene partially, register a sensation before understanding the complete context, or store information without a well-defined timeline. It's not that memory is failing. It's being fed confusing data. Memory, in turn, is not a faithful record of reality. It is reconstructive. Every time you access a memory, the brain recreates it, adjusts details, and mixes sensations. In a state of anxiety, this process intensifies. The brain accesses memories more frequently to help in making quick decisions. It seeks known patterns to reduce uncertainty. The problem is that, when the mind is racing, these consultations with the past happen too quickly, sometimes even before the present is fully processed. It is precisely at this point that the great mental click occurs. When attention and memory overlap out of sync, the brain may register something as familiar before understanding what it really is. The experience is still ongoing, but the feeling of recognition has already appeared. This generates déjà vu. Not because you lived through it before, but because the brain accessed a fragment of memory that partially fits that situation. The conscious mind tries to explain, but cannot find a clear origin, and the feeling of repetition arises. This process is invisible, silent, and extremely fast. The person doesn't perceive the error, only feels the effect. And the more accelerated the mind is, the greater the chance of this mismatch occurring. Anxiety creates the perfect environment for this because it accelerates thoughts, reduces pauses, and decreases the quality of sustained attention. The brain begins to function automatically, taking shortcuts to handle everything. These shortcuts, although efficient, are not always accurate. There's a hidden truth in this process that few people realize. The brain prioritizes speed over accuracy when it feels threatened. It chooses to respond quickly rather than perfectly. This choice was essential for human survival throughout evolution. However, in the modern world, where threats are more psychological than physical, this same mechanism generates strange side effects. Déjà vu is one of them. The impact of this goes beyond scientific curiosity. It affects the confidence we have in our own perception. When you experience déjà vu for a few seconds, reality seems unstable. Doubt arises, a feeling of strangeness, a sensation that something doesn't fit. For an already anxious mind, this can generate even more unease. The brain tries to understand what happened, revisits memories, questions automatic decisions. All of this fuels the cycle of mental acceleration. But when you understand this mechanism, something changes. Déjà vu ceases to be a frightening mystery and becomes a sign. An indication that attention is fragmented and that the mind is overloaded. It reveals important behind-the-scenes aspects of internal workings, showing how emotions, focus, and memory are deeply connected. They are not isolated areas. They communicate all the time, influencing how we experience each moment. This understanding changes the mindset. Instead of fighting the experience or trying to ignore it, the possibility of observation arises. Déjà vu comes to be seen as part of a journey of self-discovery. A reflection of the impact that the pace of life, internal pressures, and emotional state have on the mind. It subtly shows that the brain is trying to handle more things than it can clearly process. And the more we look at this connection between anxiety, attention, and memory, the more we realize that it explains not only déjà vu, but many other strange phenomena of human experience. Feelings of unreality, lapses in focus, decisions made automatically, difficulty staying in the present. All of this stems from the same point of imbalance. A brain that runs too fast ends up tripping over its own perception. This is a powerful revelation because it pulls us out of a passive position. Instead of being victims of strange experiences, we begin to understand the signals that the mind emits. Déjà vu in this context is not a random error but a message. A clue that something in the way we are living, thinking, and feeling deserves attention. And when we begin to see it this way, new questions naturally arise, leading reflection to even deeper layers of brain function. Before continuing this conversation, write in the comments, "That makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding why do anxious people tend to experience more déjà vu? It's one of the most transformative revelations of this entire journey. Here, everything starts to become visual, almost tangible, as if we could see what happens behind the scenes of the mind while life goes on seemingly normally. Imagine a simple everyday situation. You're driving, walking, or even talking to someone, but your mind isn't fully present. Part of you is revisiting a previous conversation, another part is anticipating a decision you need to make later, and another is assessing whether something could go wrong. This is the typical mental state of anxiety. The body is in the present, but the mind is scattered across multiple time periods simultaneously. This fragments the experience of the now. When anxiety is present, the perception of the present moment ceases to be continuous. The brain begins to capture fragments of reality, instead of registering the experience as a whole. It's like watching a movie skipping frames without realizing it. The story still makes sense, but something doesn't quite fit together. And it is precisely in these small gaps that déjà vu takes hold. Anxious people live in a constant state of internal distraction, even when they seem externally focused. They can work, converse, make decisions, but their brains are always processing something else in the background. This creates an excess of information circulating at the same time. The impact of this is that the brain, in order to avoid collapse, begins to simplify, anticipate, and complete experiences before they even end. This anticipation generates a feeling of artificial familiarity. Let's bring this to something very common. Imagine entering a new place, but one that vaguely resembles another environment you've seen before. A similar smell, similar lighting, a familiar layout. In a calm brain, this goes almost unnoticed. But in an anxious brain, these fragments quickly activate similar memories. The brain makes connections too quickly and concludes, this has already happened. The hidden truth is that it only recognized incomplete patterns. Another simple example is a conversation. Sometimes, during a dialogue, an anxious person already imagines what the other person will say, mentally prepares responses, and revisits past conversations to avoid mistakes. When something similar to what they anticipated happens, that strange feeling of repetition arises. Not because the conversation has already occurred, but because the brain simulated that scenario seconds before. Déjà vu is born from this anticipated simulation. Anxiety also directly interferes with how time is perceived. Moments seem to pass too quickly or too slowly. This temporal distortion further scrambles the record of experience. The brain may interpret something recently experienced as if it happened a long time ago, creating the illusion of a distant memory. It's a temporary glitch in processing reality, not a permanent error. This type of failure is much more common than you might think. It happens because the anxious brain operates in energy-saving mode. It needs to deal with so many internal demands that it starts reusing old information, shortcuts, and patterns to cope with the present. The impact of this is a constant feeling of, I've seen this before, I've lived through this before, this sounds familiar. Not because the world repeats itself, but because the brain is too overloaded to process everything from scratch. This dynamic profoundly affects a person's mindset. Gradually, they begin to distrust their own perception, question their decisions, and feel disconnected from reality. Déjà vu ceases to be merely curious and becomes unsettling. But when we understand the mechanism behind it, something important happens. Clarity emerges. And clarity generates transformation. The anxious brain isn't broken. It's trying to protect, predict, and control. However, in this continuous effort, it ends up creating subtle distortions in how reality is perceived. Déjà vu is one of these distortions. A side effect of a system that works too fast, without enough pauses to align attention, perception, and memory. The most interesting thing is that these failures don't signify a loss of control, but rather an excess of it. An excessive attempt to control the future, decisions, and potential threats. The brain, in trying to anticipate everything, ends up confusing what is experienced with what was imagined seconds before. This confusion generates the sensation of repetition. When we observe this calmly, we realize that déjà vu can be a silent invitation to presence. A sign that the mind is too far from the now. A reflection of the impact that the accelerated pace of modern life, internal pressures, and constant expectations have on mental functioning. It's not an isolated problem. It's part of a larger journey of understanding one's own mind. As this understanding deepens, it becomes clear that déjà vu doesn't arise from nothing. It's built little by little, in the way we think, react, and anticipate the world. It reveals how anxiety fragments the experience of the present and creates small noises in the perception of reality. And it is precisely in these noises that the feeling of familiarity without origin appears. When we begin to see this, new layers open up. Because if anxiety fragments perception, alters time, and accelerates the mind, what else might it be influencing without us realizing it? What other strange experiences might arise from this same internal workings? That's when this conversation starts to gain even more weight, preparing the ground for deeper understandings of the human brain. Before continuing, write in the comments, "That makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a silent question that arises in many people's minds when déjà vu happens. Is this dangerous? Is it a sign of something wrong? Is something serious happening in the brain? This doubt is more common than it seems, and often, it generates more anxiety than the phenomenon itself. Therefore, understanding this point is fundamental to bringing calm, clarity, and a real sense of security. In the vast majority of cases, déjà vu is not an illness, it is not a neurological disorder, and it does not represent any direct risk. It does not indicate that the brain is failing, nor that the person is losing control of reality. On the contrary, déjà vu is usually just a sign of how the brain is dealing with excessive stimuli, emotional pressure, and mental overload. It is a response, not a breakdown. The human brain is an incredibly complex structure, designed to function efficiently, quickly, and adaptably. It makes thousands of decisions per minute, filters information, discards excess, and creates shortcuts to save energy. When everything is balanced, this system works almost imperceptibly. But when the mind is overloaded, these shortcuts become more evident. Déjà vu arises precisely there, as a small noise in this process. It's important to understand that the brain doesn't use words to warn us when we're tired. It signals through sensations, lapses, and strange experiences. Déjà vu is one of these messages. It doesn't say, "something is wrong," but rather, "something too intense is happening inside." This is a hidden truth that completely changes how we interpret the phenomenon. Instead of a threat, it becomes an indicator of mental state. Many people who experience déjà vu more frequently also report periods of high stress, excessive responsibilities, constant pressure to make decisions, or difficulty slowing down. The impact of this is cumulative. The brain enters a continuous operating mode without real pauses, and begins to show small misalignments in the processing of reality. Nothing serious, nothing permanent, but noticeable enough to cause strangeness. There is a huge difference between signs of mental overload and signs of illness. In the case of common déjà vu, it is brief, fleeting, and not accompanied by loss of consciousness, prolonged confusion, or disorientation. It appears, causes bewilderment, and disappears. The brain quickly reorganizes itself and continues functioning normally. This is an essential point to reassure those who experience it. When we understand this, something important happens in a person's mindset. Fear diminishes. The interpretation changes. Déjà vu ceases to be seen as a threatening event and begins to be understood as part of intense mental functioning. This change in perspective has a huge impact because fear tends to amplify anxiety, and anxiety in turn increases the chance of new strange experiences. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. By removing fear, the cycle begins to break. The person starts to observe the phenomenon with more curiosity and less tension. And this internal change already alters how the brain reacts. The journey ceases to be one of confrontation and becomes one of understanding. This doesn't mean ignoring what happens, but seeing more clearly what lies behind the experience. Of course, there are rare situations in which frequent episodes of déjà vu may be associated with other neurological conditions. But these cases are exceptions and are usually accompanied by other clear, persistent, and intense signs. What we are talking about here is common déjà vu, the kind experienced by healthy people, especially during periods of emotional overload, personal transformation, or significant internal changes. And this brings us to an even more interesting point. Déjà vu often arises during times of transition. Changes in routine, important decisions, new responsibilities, phases of personal growth. The brain needs to adapt to new patterns, reorganize references, and create new connections. This adaptation process requires mental energy and can generate small, temporary glitches in perception. Déjà vu in this context is not a problem, but a reflection of the ongoing adjustment. This understanding brings a very powerful sense of security. It reinforces the idea that the brain is trying to cope with a complex reality, and not failing. It is reorganizing itself, recalibrating, seeking balance. The phenomenon comes to be seen as part of a larger process of internal transformation, and not as something isolated or threatening. When we talk about emotional impact, this makes all the difference. Confidence in one's own mental functioning is restored. The person stops feeling strange, defective, or out of control. They realize they are not alone and that what they feel has an explanation, logic, and context. This feeling of belonging and understanding strengthens the connection with one's own human experience. And the more this clarity sets in, the more space opens up to observe other subtle signals from the brain. Because déjà vu rarely comes alone. It usually walks alongside other signs of overload, such as difficulty concentrating, a feeling of being on autopilot, or lapses in awareness. All of this is part of the same system trying to function under pressure. This perception opens an important door. If déjà vu can be a sign of mental overload, then it can also be an invitation. An invitation to look more closely at the rhythm of one's own life, at the volume of thoughts, at the way decisions are being made, and at the space that the present occupies in daily life. And when this reflection begins, new connections are formed, leading to even deeper understandings of how the mind works. Before we move on with this conversation, leave a comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when anxiety and déjà vu go hand in hand, the brain starts leaving very clear clues. The problem is that almost no one has learned to observe them. Before shouting, the mind always whispers. It warns in subtle details, in repeating patterns, in small changes that seem harmless, but which carry an important truth about what is happening behind the scenes of the mental experience. One of the first things to observe is the frequency. An isolated episode of déjà vu is common and part of the human experience. But when these sensations begin to arise more regularly, especially at certain periods of life, the brain is trying to communicate something. Not dramatically but strategically. It shows that there is a constant overlap between past, present, and anticipation of the future. And this rarely happens by chance. Another very clear pattern is linked to stressful moments. Notice how déjà vu tends to appear during periods of emotional pressure, important decisions, internal conflicts, or excessive responsibilities. During these phases, the mind enters survival mode, trying to handle everything at once. The impact of this is that attention becomes fragmented and the perception of the present moment loses clarity. The overloaded brain begins to reuse old patterns to accelerate responses. That's when the feeling of familiarity without origin appears. The mental fatigue. This is another strong sign. Not just physical tiredness, but that silent exhaustion that comes from overthinking, overdeciding, overcontrolling. When the mind is tired, it loses the ability to register experiences clearly. Moments become blurred, mixed up, less defined. And when something isn't registered clearly, the brain may interpret it as something already experienced. Not because it was, but because it wasn't fully processed. A lack of sleep. This intensifies all of that. Sleep is the brain's primary time for reorganization. It's where memories are consolidated, information is filtered, and excesses are discarded. When rest is insufficient, this process remains incomplete. The result is a brain functioning with too many files open at the same time. During the day, this manifests as lapses in attention, a feeling of unreality, and, of course, more frequent episodes of déjà vu. There's also an interesting emotional pattern. Many people report experiencing déjà vu when they are emotionally detached from the present. Not necessarily sad but disconnected. They are living on autopilot, following routines, making quick decisions without truly feeling the moment. This detachment creates a shallow experience of the now. And when the present is not lived in depth, the brain tries to fill it with familiar references. It's an unconscious way of seeking stability. All of this shows something very important. Déjà vu doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's built up gradually as a result of accumulation. An accumulation of tension, unresolved thoughts, sleepless nights, decisions made without pause. It's an effect, not the cause. And when we realize this, curiosity transforms into self-knowledge. The brain is extremely intelligent. Before collapsing, it signals. Before failing, it adjusts. Before screaming, it whispers through strange but revealing experiences. Déjà vu is one of those revelations. It shows that something in the way we are living deserves attention. Not judgment, not fear, just attention. This observation completely changes one's mindset. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" the question becomes, "What is my brain trying to show me?" This shift in perspective has a profound impact. It removes the person from the position of victim of their own mental functioning and places them as an active observer of their own internal journey. When anxiety and déjà vu go hand in hand, they reveal much about the pace of life, about the excess of stimuli, and about the modern difficulty of remaining fully present. They show that the brain is trying to keep up with a reality that is too fast-paced. And, in this effort, it ends up mixing times, sensations, and memories. Recognizing these patterns doesn't solve everything immediately, but it opens a powerful door, the door to awareness. From there, each experience ceases to be merely strange and becomes informative. Déjà vu becomes an internal thermometer, an indicator of mental load, a sign that perhaps it's time to slow down, reorganize, and reconnect with the present moment. And when this awareness begins to form, other questions naturally arise. Because if the brain sends signals before screaming, what happens when these signals are ignored for too long? What other experiences might emerge when the overload persists? That's when this conversation begins to touch on even deeper layers of human experience. Before continuing, write in the comments, "That makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a mystery that remains even after all the rational, scientific, and emotional explanations we've explored so far. A point where logic and experience meet, but don't completely close. And perhaps that's exactly where déjà vu becomes so fascinating. Because, ultimately, it may reveal something even bolder about how the human brain works. The possibility that the mind is constantly trying to predict what comes next. The brain wasn't just made to react to the world. It was shaped to anticipate. Every decision, every movement, every interpretation of reality goes through an internal system that calculates probabilities. What is safest? What is most likely? What could go wrong? In an anxious brain, this system works at maximum intensity. The mind doesn't wait for the future to arrive, it runs towards it. And sometimes it runs too fast. When we think about it, déjà vu takes on a new layer of meaning. What if this feeling of familiarity isn't just a memory lapse, but an overprediction? What if the brain, in trying to anticipate the next second, ends up confusing expectation with memory? The hidden truth is that the anxious brain simulates scenarios all the time. It rehearses conversations, imagines responses, constructs possibilities. All of this happens before the actual experience. Now imagine this process happening at high speed. The brain projects a probable scenario, creates an internal simulation, and seconds later, something very similar actually happens. The conscious mind perceives the coincidence but doesn't understand its origin. The feeling that arises is clear: this has already happened. But perhaps it didn't happen in the external world. Perhaps it happened within the mind. This point completely changes the perspective. Déjà vu ceases to be merely an illusory repetition of the past and becomes a clash between prediction and reality. A moment in which the brain recognizes something it has just created as a hypothesis. In a state of anxiety where anticipation is constant, this collision becomes more frequent. The mind gets so ahead of itself that it ends up stumbling over its own process. This phenomenon reveals something profound about the modern mindset. We live at a pace that demands quick decisions, immediate responses, and constant control. The brain learns to function in this accelerated mode. It tries to reduce uncertainty by predicting everything it can. The impact of this is that the present ceases to be merely lived and becomes constantly compared with future versions imagined seconds before. And when these imagined versions coincide with what actually happens, the brain feels familiarity. Not because it remembered, but because it recognized its own prediction. Déjà vu, in this sense, can be a side effect of a brain trying to master the future instead of inhabiting the present. A silent attempt to maintain control in an unpredictable world. This interpretation does not invalidate previous explanations about attention, memory, and perception. On the contrary, it complements them. Fragmented attention, accelerated memory, and excessive anticipation form a powerful trio. Together they create an experience in which time seems to bend. Past, present, and future blend together in fractions of a second. Déjà vu arises from this intersection. The emotional impact of this idea is significant, because it touches on something very human: the fear of the unknown. Anxiety arises precisely from the difficulty of dealing with what has not yet happened. The brain tries to protect itself by anticipating. Except that, in this continuous effort, it creates illusions of familiarity. Déjà vu can be one of these illusions. A sign that the mind is more concerned with predicting than with feeling. This also explains why déjà vu often disappears as quickly as it appears. As soon as the brain realizes that the prediction doesn't hold up completely, it corrects course. The sensation dissipates. Reality reorganizes itself. But the strangeness remains. And along with it, the nagging question: why did this happen now? Perhaps the answer lies not in a single point, but in the sum of everything explored so far. Anxiety, fragmented attention, reconstructive memory, mental overload, and constant anticipation. Déjà vu may be the end result of this complex equation. Not a mistake, but a byproduct of a highly adaptive brain trying to cope with a world that is too fast-paced. This revelation changes the way we look at these strange experiences. They cease to be threatening and become informative. déjà vu becomes a mirror. It reflects how we are living, thinking, and relating to time. It shows the impact of internal haste, the need for control, and the difficulty of remaining in the present. And perhaps that's why déjà vu is never fully explained. Because it's not just an isolated phenomenon, but a symptom of something bigger. A reminder that the human brain is powerful, creative, and sometimes too fast for its own good. A brain that tries to predict the future can end up confusing prediction with memory. This reflection doesn't end the conversation. On the contrary, it opens up even more space for profound questions about consciousness, time, and perception. Because if the brain is capable of creating the sensation of repetition when trying to predict what comes next, what else might it be creating without us realizing it? What other strange experiences might arise from this same silent impulse of anticipation? And it is precisely at this point that this journey continues to gain new layers, inviting us to look at the workings of the mind with even more curiosity and attention. If this reflection resonated with you in any way, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, it's because this topic resonated with you on some level. Perhaps it brought back memories of specific moments, or maybe it offered a new perspective on experiences that previously seemed strange or inexplicable. If this content has helped you understand a little better what happens inside your mind, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to continue this journey with me, exploring the inner workings of the human brain with more depth, curiosity, and clarity. If you want, leave a comment saying, "I'm with you until the end," or, "This message was for me." I really do read, and that also helps me understand what kind of reflection makes the most sense to you. And if this conversation captivated you, liking the video is just a quick gesture to show that this type of content deserves to continue existing and reaching more people who also ask themselves these questions. And now, if your mind is still full of thoughts, there's a video here that complements this topic and delves even deeper into this reflection. Click and continue reading there.